How does a child grow up to become the man whose very name would haunt the headlines of America's darkest nights? How does someone raised among family dinners and baseball games end up whispered about in courtrooms and prison yards? These aren't just questions about crime, they're questions about human nature, about the mind's fragile thresholds, and about the pain we hide long before it explodes. Richard Ramirez wasn't a monster in the way headlines once suggested. He was a man, a boy, a teenager, a son. And like every person who ever walked down a violent road, he started somewhere far more familiar, a place most of us have been. This isn't a story about what he did. This is a story about how a mind breaks quietly, how emotions go unheard, and how darkness doesn't always come crashing in. Sometimes it just seeps. In this video, we'll trace the psychological evolution of Richard Ramirez, not to excuse and not to shock, but to understand. Because behind every infamous name is a real human mind that didn't wake up evil. It just stopped healing. Between 1984 and 1985, Richard Ramirez was responsible for a series of home invasions, burglaries, and murders that left Southern California in fear. He did not follow a clear pattern. His victims varied by age, gender, and background. What made his actions even more disturbing was their unpredictability. The media soon gave him a name, the Night Stalker. But that name, though chilling, only scratched the surface. Over time, investigators connected him to over a dozen murders and multiple assaults. He was eventually convicted of 13 counts of murder, as well as rape, burglary, and other serious crimes. The trials drew nationwide attention not just for what he had done, but for the strange, almost distant calm he showed in court. Still, this video is not about those events. We won't replay the trauma. We won't focus on fear. Instead, we'll explore what led a young man to become so detached from empathy, from reality, and from himself. To understand that, we have to go back before the headlines, before the trials. Back to where it all began. Before the courtroom stairs, before the media gave him a name. He was just Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez, born February 29, 1960 in El Paso, Texas. The youngest of 5 children, Richard was raised in a working-class Mexican-American family. His father, Julian, was a former policeman in Juarez who later worked on the Santa Fe Railroad. From the outside, the Ramirez family looked like many others, a house with children, jobs, responsibilities, and the quiet pressure to survive. But inside the home, things were not calm. Julian Ramirez was known to have a short temper. Discipline often crossed the line into physical punishment. The house, instead of being a safe place, was often filled with fear, silence, and unpredictability. Richard, as a child, was described by some teachers as quiet, even polite. He enjoyed music, comic books, and baseball, but something in him, something hard to name, was already beginning to fracture. At just 12 years old, he began spending long hours alone. He slept in cemeteries to avoid his father's anger. And slowly, the outside world began to feel safer than the one inside his own home. He was still just a boy, but already a disconnect was forming, one that would deepen over time, not all at once, but slowly, subtly, and dangerously. Every story has early signs, small moments, that later become warnings. For Richard Ramirez, those signs began to appear in childhood and grew louder in adolescence. His relationship with his father was already strained, volatile, strict, and often violent. But it wasn't just discipline that shaped him. It was the lack of emotional safety, a home where fear was routine and tenderness rare. As Richard grew older, he began gravitating toward escape, not just physical, but mental. At age 12, one figure would profoundly shape his worldview: his older cousin Miguel Mike Ramirez, a Vietnam War veteran with deep psychological scars. Mike wasn't just a family member, he became Richard's role model. But instead of teaching values or resilience, Mike exposed him to stories of violence, brutality, and dehumanization. He showed Richard graphic photos of war victims and spoke casually about acts of cruelty committed overseas. It wasn't just disturbing, it was desensitizing. Imagine a 12-year-old boy already scared at home, now absorbing trauma secondhand from someone he trusted. At age 13, Richard was present when Mike shot and killed his wife during a domestic argument. Richard witnessed the murder with his own eyes. From that point on, something in him, something essential, began to shut down. He started withdrawing from school, isolating from friends, and spending more time wandering the streets at night. He began using marijuana and later experimented with LSD. Sleep became erratic. His mood shifted often from numbness to rage to silence. Some experts later suggested signs of antisocial behavior, possibly post-traumatic stress, and even early personality disorder traits. According to Dr. Linda Hayes, a forensic psychologist, Ramirez showed indicators of detachment from empathy and cognitive dissonance as early as his teenage years. But at the time, no one was listening, no one was watching. And the boy with the soft voice became a teenager with eyes that stopped blinking. Some breaks happen suddenly, but most begin with pressure. In the case of Richard Ramirez, his descent wasn't a dramatic fall, it was a slow erosion. By his late teens, Richard was already showing signs of psychological disconnection. The combination of trauma, instability, and unresolved fear left him without the tools to manage emotion or even understand it. As he moved into early adulthood, the triggers began to multiply. He dropped out of school. He left home frequently, drifting between cities. Jobs were short-lived, relationships shallow or non-existent. He often wandered alone, walking through city streets late into the night, not looking for trouble but not avoiding it either. He began stealing. Not always for need, sometimes just for the thrill. The line between fantasy and reality was already blurring. He was particularly drawn to dark imagery, symbols of death, evil, and rebellion. For Ramirez, these weren't just curiosities. They became part of his identity, an armor against his inner chaos. According to Dr. Elisa Grady, a clinical psychologist, this kind of fascination with dark iconography can signal a deep desire for control, especially in individuals who grew up in powerless environments. And Richard was exactly that, a boy who had felt powerless for years. There were identity crises too. He began calling himself different names, experimenting with satanic symbols, not just as rebellion, but as redefinition. He wasn't just breaking away from his past, he was trying to become someone else. And underneath it all, rejection, isolation, unprocessed grief. By the time he reached his early 20s, those unresolved emotions had hardened into distorted beliefs. That empathy was weakness, that pain was power, that fear could be controlled if he became the one causing it. The boy who had once hidden from violence was now becoming its vessel. It didn't happen with a scream. There was no final straw, no shouting match, no dramatic moment captured in headlines. It was quieter than that, more personal, more invisible. It was a Tuesday, just another night in a long line of sleepless ones. Richard Ramirez stood in front of a mirror in a rundown motel room somewhere outside of Los Angeles. The curtains were shut. The light flickered. And the air was still. He stared at his reflection for a long time, longer than most people ever do. Not fixing his hair, not checking his clothes, just looking at his own eyes, as if waiting for someone to appear. But no one did. That's when it truly started, the internal disintegration. All the confusion, the fear, the years of numb silence didn't explode. They evaporated. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He simply stopped. Stopped asking why. Stopped wondering what he could have been. Stopped hoping someone might reach for him. This wasn't rage. It was resignation. This is who I am now, he might have thought. Not proudly, not even sadly. Just matter of fact. In that moment, something important died: his ability to care. Care for others. Care for himself. Care about consequence. It's tempting to think darkness crashes in like thunder, but for some it arrives like fog. Soft, quiet, and absolute. That night, Richard didn't make a decision to hurt anyone. He made a decision to feel nothing. And once you let go of feeling, what's left to stop you? By the time Richard Ramirez crossed the line into criminal behavior, his internal world had already changed. What happens in a person's mind in those hours, days, even years before a crime, often says more than the act itself. For Richard, that pre-crime space was filled with rationalizations, distorted beliefs, and a growing sense of emotional detachment. He no longer saw people as people. They became symbols, objects in a world he no longer felt connected to. He believed in fate, but in a twisted way, as if his path had already been written, and he was simply following the script. In his mind, power came from control, and control in his world meant fear. He began to justify his actions long before he ever took them, telling himself things like, "They deserve it. The world is corrupt. I've seen worse." This is what psychologists call cognitive distortion, a way of bending reality to protect a fragile identity. According to Dr. Raymond Shaw, a forensic psychologist, Ramirez displayed clear patterns of externalization, meaning he blamed the world for his pain and stopped seeing his own choices as responsible. He also showed signs of emotional blunting, the gradual erosion of empathy. When you feel nothing for long enough, you begin to believe that nothing matters. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't a snap, it was drift. Like a boat untethered from the shore, his thoughts floated farther away from human connection and deeper into isolation. He didn't just commit crimes later on. He mentally detached from consequences long before. By the time his hands acted, his mind had already given permission. What happens after someone commits their first serious crime? For some, there is panic, for others, guilt. But for Richard Ramirez, there was silence. Not the kind of silence that hides, but the kind that signals something deeper: emotional detachment, possibly even validation. He didn't run in fear. He didn't confess in confusion. He went back into the night calm, cold, and controlled. To those who later observed his behavior, it seemed surreal. He showed no visible remorse, no regret. Sometimes, even amusement. This emotional response, or lack of one, points toward a phenomenon known as affective flattening, where the emotional response system becomes dulled, even in the face of extreme actions. According to Dr. Andrea Colton, a forensic psychiatrist, Ramirez exhibited what's known as limited affective empathy, meaning he could understand that people felt fear, but could no longer feel with them. He also minimized the impact of his actions, sometimes claiming the crimes had spiritual meaning or that he was simply an instrument of fate. These beliefs weren't always coherent, but they were psychologically protective. In his mind, he wasn't the villain. He was the product of a broken world and, in some ways, its mirror. Even during his trial, he maintained an eerie composure, smirking, whispering, staring blankly. Some saw it as defiance, others saw it as emptiness. But what's clear is that by then the connection between action and empathy had been severed long ago. He had crossed a line not just into criminality, but into psychological isolation. And once there, he never came back. When we look back at someone like Richard Ramirez, it's easy to see the aftermath, the crimes, the media frenzy, the shock, the fear. But what's harder to confront is the quiet, unseen build-up to it all. His story is not just about one man's darkness. It's about a failure to intervene early enough, a failure to see the signs before they became dangerous. Psychologists and mental health experts often say that early intervention is the key to preventing such tragedies. But what does early intervention really look like? It starts with awareness. The signs are often there long before someone commits a crime. In Richard's case, the emotional numbness, the withdrawal, the distorted beliefs, these were not invisible. Yet they went largely unaddressed. Why? In part because we still struggle to talk openly about mental health, about trauma, about the scars that form unseen inside. Richard's childhood was marked by neglect, violence, and early exposure to trauma. These early experiences can have a profound impact on the developing brain. They don't just shape behavior, they warp it. Many studies show that childhood abuse or neglect is one of the strongest indicators of future violent behavior, but it's also something we can prevent. Support systems, family, friends, educators, mental health professionals can make all the difference. Imagine if Richard had received the help he needed at a young age, if his trauma had been addressed, if he had been taught how to manage emotions and navigate the chaos inside. It's not just about fixing people who are broken, it's about teaching people, especially children, that there is another way to deal with their pain, one that doesn't involve isolation or violence. We can also be alert to warning signs: emotional withdrawal, intense anger, dramatic personality shifts. These could indicate underlying issues that need attention. But more importantly, we must foster a culture of empathy, a society where people feel safe enough to seek help before it's too late. It's about creating environments where mental health is prioritized, where children aren't just taught math and science, but also how to understand their feelings, how to express themselves without shame. Because if we've learned anything from cases like Richard's, it's that silence is dangerous. And so is the absence of understanding. Early intervention, yes, but more than that, it's about creating a world where people know that it's okay to ask for help, where mental health is treated as seriously as physical health. If we start there, we may be able to break the cycle before it begins. So, what can we take from all of this? Richard Ramirez's story is not just one of crime, it's one of psychological erosion, of unaddressed pain, missed signals, and a mind that gradually lost its way. He wasn't born evil, he was born human, and somewhere along the line, that humanity began to fracture. We're not here to glorify, we're not here to excuse, we're here to understand, because understanding is the first step to prevention. What happened with Ramirez didn't begin with violence. It began with neglect, trauma, isolation, and maybe the most dangerous element of all, silence. Sometimes the worst crimes begin not with hate, but with fear, silence, and unheard pain. If you're watching this and you feel that silence in your own life, or you know someone who does, don't wait for it to grow louder. Reach out, ask questions, listen without judgment, support without conditions. Mental health is not a weakness. It's part of being human. And the sooner we treat it that way, the fewer people will lose to the darkness within. If this story moved, you leave a comment below. Start a conversation. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more thoughtful explorations like this. Because behind every name, behind every headline, there's a story. And every story is a chance to understand ourselves and each other a little more clearly.